I'm Wayne Stargart. I'm the president of the MIT Free Speech Alliance. We're one of the co-sponsors for the event tonight. So along with the MIT Open Discourse Society, who's the lead sponsor, and over 20 other co-sponsors that you see on the screen behind me, we welcome you to the Fall 2024 debate on the MIT campus. Now, in addition to welcoming those of you who are here in person, I want to also welcome everyone who is watching this on the live stream. And in addition, I want to welcome the thousands of people that will watch the recording of this debate on the MIT Free Speech Alliance YouTube channel. Now, this is our fourth debate, and this time we're going to introduce a little bit of a wrinkle. We're going to add the ability for you to participate and continue the debate afterwards by using a AI-moderated discussion forum. We partnered with Sway, a research project out of Carnegie Mellon University that connects people who disagree but facilitates deeper discussions and rigorous debates while encouraging civility. So I hope there will be you see the QR code is your way of joining the debate, and there will also be links from our website. So I encourage you all to go on to Sway and join us in an ongoing debate. Before introducing our moderator, who will present tonight's resolution, I want to remind us all why we have these events. So these debates were a reaction to an event 3 years ago in which a visiting professor to this campus had their presentation canceled over personal viewpoints that they held and had expressed in print, but which had nothing to do with their scholarship. So this was an indication to us that MIT had lost a little bit of its deep commitment to academic freedom and its historic tolerance for a wide diversity of viewpoints. In reaction, we alumni started this debate series to model to the MIT community how to have a civil, vigorous intellectual discussion about topics which are controversial and as well as to broaden the topics, the range of topics which can be discussed. Okay, now it's my honor to introduce our moderator for tonight. Dr. John Tomasi is a longstanding friend of MIT and of the MIT Free Speech Alliance. Dr. Tomasi, among many other institutions, earned his PhD from Oxford, and he held a professorship chair at Brown University for several years. But about 3 years ago, he was enticed away from that comfortable chair position and to become the inaugural president of the Heterodox Academy. The Heterodox Academy is an international organization of professors who are committed to promoting open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. Now, Dr. Tomasi was here at MIT in 2023 as the speaker at MIT's inaugural Dialogue Across Differences. He's also a friend of the MIT Free Speech Alliance, having participated in our 2023 conference here on campus, as well as on one of the meetings, one of our member meetings. So we are honored to have him back at MIT. So join me in giving an enthusiastic welcome to Dr. John Tomasi. John, the platform's yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to the MIT Free Speech Alliance and to Sway and to the many other sponsors who we showed you a moment ago. Let's go to our resolution for the evening. Resolved, the total cost of global net zero decarbonization by the latter half of the century is well worth the projected global benefits. This topic that we'll be discussing this evening, is controversial in a variety of dimensions. Most obviously, perhaps, it's controversial because it's connected to broader issues of climate change and some political initiatives, including the Paris Agreement. We're not debating the Paris Agreement, we're not debating climate change, we're debating this resolution. But it's worth just noting and just stating the obvious, that this debate is in the context of those political and to some existential topics that I just mentioned. Political topics like the Paris Agreement, we've seen a succession politically in the US of Obama signing us in, Trump signing us out, Biden signing us in, and the incoming president likely to sign us out. So that fact about the political teams weighing in and weighing out of that agreement I think, they're an important background that makes a sort of extra fizz to this topic tonight, and some dangers for that reason as well. Additionally, the topic of climate change is, for many people, a supercharged, superheated issue, precisely because it's often perceived, widely perceived, to be a type of existential threat to humanity. In the face of existential threats, especially with the clock ticking, the normal human reactions is to roll out virtues such as solidarity and unity, hanging together, alignment with a common mission in the face of a crisis. Those are all political imperatives. And at the university, and especially at a great university like MIT, we need to be aware of those tendencies to move to the virtues of politics, solidarity, rather than the virtues of the academy. And the virtues of the academy are strikingly different from those virtues I just mentioned. Virtues of the academy include things like difference, heterodoxy, different kinds of viewpoints. At HXA, Heterodox Academy, we think of the university as a community of imperfect learners, a place where people, professors and students alike, come together to learn from one another, from the expertise of professors, from the curiosity of students, to come together with a certain different set of virtues to think about these issues in new ways, to look for new solutions. So pluralism and disagreement is the fuel that we need within this kind of room and this kind of conversation to make the special contributions of universities possible. The universities have an important role to play in social change, but it's widely perceived to be a role played for the long run. We do research precisely because, insofar as we're able, to have different viewpoints surrounding us. I'm going to quote something, if you'll permit me, from a Brown president. This is a line from Ruth Simmons, who was the first Black Ivy League president. And when Ruth went to Brown, she gave a wonderful convocation address that struck me so much that I wrote it down, but I think I can actually recite it, because I've said it so many times in my own head. And Ruth said, I'll hold this in case I forget part of it. Ruth said, this is an account of what a university is. She said, while other types of communities devise covenants so as to avoid conflict, our covenant at the university is rooted in quarrel and in opposition. We encourage ideas and opinions to collide in service of learning. At a great university, no idea is out of range or out of bounds, close quote. That means, it seems to me, that, as in Ruth's formulation, that division, quarrel, opposition are the fuel that we use to make ideas happen and make research go forward within universities. These forces can tear us apart because they are forces of division in important ways. But it's also important to note that not all these forces are centrifugal. And in particular, at HXA, we talk about a set of values that bring people together despite their differences, that make this magical alchemy of universities possible. So you want to have plurality of viewpoints. You want to have strongly felt opposed opinions. You want to have a culture of toleration and even celebration of eccentricities and heterodoxy. But you also need to have some common norms that can bring these forces together to produce their magical progressive work. And in HXA, we have something, these 5 virtues that we call the HXA way. I'm just going to list them to you very briefly. First, and these are norms that I'm going to hereby suggest and encourage on our panelists, our distinguished panelists, but they're also virtues and norms for you. They're for you when you ask your questions toward the end of this event, but they're also for you while you sit in your chair listening and thinking for yourself as you're hearing the arguments in front of you. Number 1, make your case with evidence. When a person gives a piece of data, a piece of evidence, it's kind of a collection point where we can sort of find a common way to track reality. Second, be intellectually charitable. Being intellectually charitable is not mere charity. It's not softness or squishiness. It's intellectual charity, which is a certain kind of charity that involves rigor. It's fully compatible with being extremely rigorous. One way to think about that virtue, be intellectually charitable, is to think about steel-manning your opponent's view rather than straw-manning them. Third, be intellectually humble. I gave a talk about humility at MIT. It was called Humility and the Search for Truth at MIT a couple of years ago. And as I noted then, and I'll say it again now, having spent some more time around MIT, and you guys won't mind this, I hope, people don't ordinarily think about humility as a virtue you find among professors, not even, or maybe especially not, among MIT professors. But that virtue of humility is what gets the ability to move forward. The greatest academics I've known in my life, in my career, have been people who have had this kind of constant impatience with the status quo. Even when there are such giants in their field, maybe especially when there are such giants in their fields, that they're the ones who help create the status quo. That idea of impatience with the given, that idea of impatience with one's own level of understanding, is what we mean by intellectual humility. Fourth, be constructive. Don't just tear them down when they screw up, because everyone screws up. Rather think what's good in what they said. How do you sift through the various things they say that you don't agree with to find the bit you might want to keep because you're going to learn something. And finally, fifth and finally, be yourself. Each of us has a life that brought us to this place in ways that we're not always can't always see ourselves. We have views, not simply for logical reasons, but for other kinds of reasons as well. It's good to be reminded of that fact occasionally, and to remember that each of us is a person with a life course that led us here, and our views are influenced perhaps by that life course. So with that, let's turn to our conversation and debate. I'll begin by introducing the teams, and there are teams. On the affirmative team, again, affirmative for this resolution, we have Kerry Emanuel, who's the MIT Professor Emeritus of Atmospheric Science and co-founder of MIT's Lorenz Center. Kerry's the author of What We All Know About Climate Change. We also have on the affirmative team, Robert Pindyck, the author of Climate Future, this book, which you did not ask me to hold up, but I'm holding up so that you can see it, and hopefully some of you will read this. Robert, or Bob, is the MIT Sloan School Professor of Economics and Finance and past president of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics. On the negative team, we have Steve Koonin, who's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a former undersecretary for science, and the author of Unsettled, the runaway bestseller. And Mark Mills, executive director of the National Center for Energy Analytics and a faculty fellow at Northwestern University School of Engineering, and author of, among other books, The Cloud Revolution. Our format is complicated enough to have come from MIT. I'll give you the general summary. It's going to be, we're going to go through 4 different waves. First, there'll be the affirmative teams. A speaker for the affirmative team will speak for 8 minutes. Then we'll have a 2-minute cross-examination from the negative team. Then, 8-minute positive statement from the negative team, 2-minute cross-examination. And then we'll do that cycle again. So we're going to go through 4 waves of that structure of an 8-minute statement and a 2-minute cross-examination. Finally, we'll conclude that part of the event in this conversation with 5-minute rebuttals from each team. At that point, we'll open the floor up to you, the audience, to invite you to ask questions, following the norms I just described, I have no doubt. We're going to begin now with Kerry Emanuel for the affirmative team. You have 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to preface my remarks, and here I think I speak for all 4 debaters, in thanking the MIT Free Speech Alliance for putting on this series of debates. I personally think it's terribly important in the era in which we live to be able to freely and openly debate the important issues of our time, and I should say civilly. So thank you very much. The phrasing of the proposition for us is a fine illustration of a problem with the approach that some take to dealing with climate change, that is, among those who consider it a problem at all. Cost-benefit analysis is appropriate where both the costs and the benefits are well known. When they are not, it becomes a problem of risk assessment and management. One is dealing with probabilities, not deterministic numbers. And we must consider the large range of risk aversion among even the most educated populace. It's a very different problem from cost benefit. So to illustrate this, consider how you would have felt, if you can imagine yourself back in this time, how you would have felt about a proposition posed in, say, 1940, as resolve, the cost to the US of entering World War II is well worth the projected benefits. At the peak of the war, the US was spending 40% of its GDP on the war effort, 4-0. And what were the benefits? Better airplane engines, more effective artillery, atom bombs? Gee, guess we better not fight this war. Better to spend our money adapting to life under fascist rule. Fortunately, clearer heads prevailed. We saw the risk and dealt with it. The climate problem we confront today might be posed as a classical problem in risk assessment and management, were it not for the fact that the risks are distributed across a broad swath of our future, extending well beyond the lifetimes of even the youngest person in this audience. The risks are global in nature, but largely felt at the levels of human communities. Mitigating the risk involves paying today to avert potentially catastrophic risks tomorrow, although recent experience shows that tomorrow is becoming today. The counter-argument to our own is usually made by a group of people who do not deny that climate change poses risk, but argue that the costs of mitigating that risk are not worth the economic pains we would suffer today. Their arguments usually make 2 serious errors, which in my view render them incorrect. First, they do what no actual risk manager would do, which is to price the most probable outcome, rather than to integrate the cost over the whole probability distribution of possible climate outcomes. Because the costs rise nonlinearly, and sometimes very nonlinearly, with the magnitude of climate change, this is a serious error. This is particularly true when there is an existential tail in the risk distribution. Second, they contradict themselves when they argue that this inappropriately estimated future risk will cost something like 3% of future GDP, a trivial cost in their view, while spending 3% today would be catastrophic to our economy. Can't have it both ways, even with clever discounting. The fact of the matter is that uncertainty about the results of increasing by order 100% the concentration of the most important long-lived greenhouse gas in our atmosphere, and uncertainty about which climate scientists have been completely open, encompasses unacceptable risks. No parent would allow their 7-year-old child to run across a busy intersection to catch her bus if they estimated there was a 10% chance she would be run down. An argument by the bystander that, well, the most likely outcome is no injury, so let her run, would hold no sway, even though driving her to school might make the parent late for work with some consequences. Yet we constantly hear arguments that climate risk isn't that large, and we don't want to incur any real cost today, by folks seemingly quite prepared to throw not just one child, but whole generations under the bus. The pity of this is that unlike many of their less well-informed colleagues, our opponents largely agree with me, I believe, on the technical approach to mitigating climate change, which involves a wholesale, full-throated commitment to building out nuclear power supplemented by renewables. We know for sure this would work because several nations, notably Sweden and France, already decarbonized their electricity production using nuclear and hydropower, and did this almost 50 years ago with no perceptible change in their GDP growth. Look, we can talk about discount rates and all that, but the fact is that the experiment has been performed by several advanced nations who decarbonize their electricity, at least, with no perceptible damage to their economies. And nuclear energy is also proven to be the safest technology we've invented so far, yet even my colleagues at the MIT Energy Initiative, while privately concurring that nuclear power must be an important part of decarbonization, emphasized renewables in their documents and press releases, perhaps lacking the courage of their actual convictions. The abandonment of nuclear energy by the West has led to the absurd and tragic outcome of 3 Chernobyl deaths per day, that are currently lost to respiratory diseases stemming from fossil fuel combustion. Yet, here we stand, equivocating at the threshold of a potentially far greater tragedy, imposing absurd and costly regulations on nuclear power plants, such as insisting through an act of Congress that they be able to withstand a 1 in 10 million year earthquake or windstorm, while at the same time promoting highly weather-sensitive and volatile renewable energy that has the effect of prolonging our dependence on fossil fuels. So I call on our distinguished opposition team members to abandon their Panglossian efforts to downplay climate risk and switch to promoting solutions that will carry us into the 22nd century while enabling the elimination of energy poverty in developing nations and the responsible growth of artificial intelligence, which requires substantial energy resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. We now have 2 minutes for cross-examination by the negative team.
So, Kerry, thanks a lot for kicking things off in a very appropriate way. When I listen to the politicians and the media, I don't get a sense of probabilities. I get a sense of definitiveness. If you listen to Secretary General Guterres, for example, we're on a road to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. It's very different than what you just said, and of course what most scientists understand. Why is it that the scientific establishment has not called him and other people out for that kind of misrepresentation?
Excellent question, Steve. Some scientific establishment has called out such people. As you can imagine, they are not usually selected for publication in newspapers. You have a point, and one of the problems we have in this whole climate business is there are lots of folks out there who get it wrong about risk and feel that we have to argue certainty to be heard. Yeah. So yeah, sure.
Mark. I think that's, again, thanks MIT, and it's a great kickoff. Here's an interesting problem, and I wonder how much you've thought about this. France is a great example of a country that embraced nuclear energy. I'm a nuclear bull like you. But what the French do with proper accounting, and perhaps you've looked into this as well, what it turns out they've done, they exported their carbon footprint, and when they undertook an examination of their total per capita carbon footprint, counting imports of goods and materials that rose as they essentially tamped down their industrial growth, they concluded that their per capita footprint went up, not down, as they expanded their nuclear capacity, because, as you know, electricity is only a third of all the energy supply. So this is the challenge, is how do we get our arms around proper accounting, because the world's carbon emissions have been rising, not declining.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move, if I may.
Okay.
So the next wave, it will be for the negative team. Steve Koonin, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you. The resolution requires that we consider the benefits of 50-year decarbonization. The timescale comes from the Paris goal of limiting global average temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And then we must compare those benefits with the cost of achieving net zero. That comparison is complicated, not least because of the uncertainties in the allegedly avoided impacts of human influences on the climate and in the costs of net zero. There's also the issue of well worth it to whom, as well as the question of what urgency is there in reducing emissions. I have 3 points to make. The timescale for reduction is arbitrary, the climate threat is far from dire, and the cost-benefit calculus very much depends upon who's doing the calculation. Let me start with the Paris goal itself, less than 2-degree rise in the global average surface temperature, which has been deemed to require net zero global emissions by the latter half of this century. Yet emissions continue to rise and will again be at an all-time high this year. The subtitles of the UN's annual emissions gap report give a flavor of the lack of progress. In 2023, it was broken record. Temperatures hit new highs, yet world fails to cut emissions again. And this year, it was no more hot air, please. But even that 2-degree limit is not a hard one. When I asked many years ago Hans Schellenhuber, the so-called father of the 2-degree limit, why 2 degrees? He responded, it's about right, and it's an easy number for politicians to remember. So all manner of chaos will not suddenly break out if we hit 2 or even 3 degrees. Next, is the climate threat so dire that it requires the precipitous action of transforming the entire world's energy system in a few decades? The answer to that question is not as uncertain as our opponents claim. Consider that the globe has warmed 1.3 degrees in the last 120 years, since 1900, and about the same amount of warming is expected over the next century. So we have some guidance from the past. In fact, rather than catastrophe, humanity has seen unprecedented prosperity despite, or perhaps because of that prior temperature rise. The global average lifespan has gone from 32 years to 72 years. Per capita GDP has gone up by a factor of 7. The literacy rate has soared, and the death rate from extreme weather events has decreased by a factor of 50. So it's hard to believe that comparable warming over the next century is going to significantly derail that progress. And in fact, the consensus of economic impact studies, as published by the Biden White House last year, is that the US GDP would be only a few percent smaller for a few degrees of warming. That's not a few percent per year, but a few percent when the warming has occurred. That's in the noise, as we physicists say. Of course, there will be differential impacts, there are uncertainties, and GDP isn't everything. Nevertheless, those are hardly predictions of a catastrophe. If you listen to the popular media, you might believe that we humans have already broken the climate. Yet the IPCC can't find climatically significant trends in most climate impact drivers, let alone attribute them to human influences. Losses from extreme weather events are actually declining as a percent of GDP as the world becomes more resilient. And projections of future warming have moderated as the IPCC refines its models and the world emits somewhat less than has been expected, both because of slower development and a shift to lower carbon intensity energy sources. Finally, the resolution begs the question of worth it to whom? While the 1.5 billion of us in the developed world have adequate energy, most of the world craves more energy. The inequalities are astounding. Nigerian per capita energy consumption is 1/30 that of the US. And some 3 billion people in the world use less electricity every year than the average US refrigerator. Fossil fuels are the most effective way of providing the reliable and affordable energy those folks need to improve their lot. So any restraints on emissions immorally hinders development. Decarbonization is an unaffordable luxury for most of the world, who face many more immediate, tangible, and soluble problems than the risk of some future climate disbenefit where we don't know what, we don't know when, we don't know how severe. Urging, cajoling, requiring the developing world to forswear fossil fuels, as the World Bank and other financiers have been doing, is directly contrary to human flourishing. It's like telling a starving person not to eat that steak because it might be a cholesterol problem. You might counter that there are other benefits of eliminating fossil fuels, for example, reducing local air pollution. But consider the case of China, where life expectancy increased by 10 years between 1980 and 2020, even as fossil fuel use increased by 700%. Some of that reduction was due to indoor air pollution reducing due to cleaner cooking fuels. And even the dirty Chinese coal plants had great benefit, since increased energy availability was much more important than cleaner air at the time. In accounting costs and benefits globally, you also have to include the benefits of rising CO2 levels. Yes, I know for some of you it might be difficult to believe that there are benefits, but let me assure you that there are some. One of them is deaths from extreme temperatures have decreased in recent decades, since roughly 10 times as many people die from extreme cold events, which are declining, rather than from heat waves, which are increasing modestly. Another is that the Earth has greened palpably. By one measure, it's 40% greener than it was 40 years ago. That's also caused agricultural productivity to soar, since plants love CO2. In summary, there's no climate emergency or climate crisis, and hence no need for precipitous decarbonization that's implied by the resolution. As Mark Mills will describe, that kind of energy transition will be, in fact, already is disruptive and very expensive. In fact, most of the world is already saying, we won't decarbonize unless you pay us for it. And we in the developed world just don't have the resources to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We now have 2 minutes for cross-examination by the affirmative team.
Yeah, Steve, let me ask you a question to make sure I understand what you said.
Yep.
I think you said that there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, a lot of uncertainty about how the climate system works, a lot of uncertainty about what might happen to temperatures and what the impact on GDP and so forth might be. We live in a world of considerable uncertainty. Am I right about that?
There are certainly uncertainties in the science, absolutely.
And also in the economics?
Yes, of course.
Okay, good. So we're in agreement on that.
Right. We live in a world of uncertainty.
Yep, we do.
You took a car here, I'm sure, or have taken cars in the past. There's a 1% chance of your dying in an automobile accident during your lifetime,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Uncertainty, we live with it.
Good. Okay.
It would be very nice, and I wanted to ask you this question, if science could just learn from the past, the fact that we've had about a degree in 0.3 of warming, and extrapolate to the future. Why do you think scientists haven't done that largely? Done the exercise that you did, saying, well, it's another 1.3 degrees. We lived through 1.3 without any problems, so the next. Why do you think they haven't done
I
that?
don't know what you mean by done the exercise. Certainly the facts I reeled off are well known to scientists. And
I'm just wondering if you're aware of other man-made influences on climate other than CO2?
oh, of course, there's
Yeah.
methane, there are
And-
aerosols which cool,
Yes.
and the other greenhouse gases, of course. Yeah.
It's been the aerosols have been a big contribution.
understand.
And they're gone.
Yeah. If I have 20 seconds, story. When I got to BP,
Yeah.
BP was pushing gas as a bridge to a low-carbon future, and I reminded them, I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, that the offsetting loss of aerosols would be much greater warming than any decrease in the emissions. And of course, other people have done that calculation since. So it's complicated.
And that's why the 1.3 degrees is not really a good guide,
I
because
understand.
it doesn't involve the aerosols in the future. Yep.
Thank you. We're now going to move to the third wave. Bob Pindyck has 8 minutes to speak on the affirmative for the affirmative team.
Thanks. So I'm going to pick up on where Steve left off on that question I asked about uncertainty, that we live in a world of uncertainty. And I want to tell you just briefly, I want to summarize some of the uncertainty involved in climate change and its impact. And what I'm going to tell you is much of what's in my book about climate change. There are two things that we're very uncertain about. One is called, we're uncertain about a lot of things, but two in particular. One is called what we call climate sensitivity, which means that even if we knew how much CO2 we're going to be emitting over the coming decades, and we knew what the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere will be, what would that do to the temperature? And that's called climate sensitivity. How sensitive is the global mean temperature to an increase in the CO2 concentration? And the answer is we don't really know. We have probability distributions, and you can look at the IPCC, for example, to get a sense of what those probability distributions are, but we don't know the actual number. The second area where there's even much more uncertainty is the impact. Suppose we knew for certain that we're going to have a 3-degree increase in the global mean temperature in the next 30 years. What would that do? If it doesn't do anything to GDP or to life as we know it, who cares? What matters is what happens if it does do something. What would be the impact of that 3 degrees of warming on our economy, on our society, and so on? And the answer there is we really don't know. We know very, very little because we've never experienced, as an industrial society, warming of 3 degrees. We don't have data. We have a limited amount of theory, but we don't have data, so we just don't know. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, all right? We don't know about adaptation. We know that warming will happen slowly, and we don't know how rapidly we can adapt to warming by building seawalls, for example, if there's an increase in sea levels, by creating hybrid crops, and so on, planting crops in different locations. That's called adaptation. We don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty there. So you might think at this point that I've joined the negative team, right? Because we don't know anything. And so to use Steve's suggestion, we should wait. Let's learn more before we start spending money, before we start decarbonizing, right? Now, Steve and Mark, I assume you don't bother with health insurance because you don't know whether you're going to get sick or when you're going to get sick or how sick you might get and what your medical bills might look like. So why insure? There's too much uncertainty. And if you own a home, I assume you don't bother with homeowners insurance because you don't know if a tree is going to fall on your house and when or if and how much damage that'll cost. I, on the other hand, take the opposite view. I do have health insurance. And I do have homeowners insurance. And I think we need climate insurance. It's the uncertainty that is the reason we need to do something to decarbonize. It's the opposite conclusion. I agree with Steve that there's a huge amount of uncertainty about climate change. A lot we don't understand, we don't know. The climate system is incredibly complex, and the linkage to the economy is even more complex. Steve's conclusion is don't do anything. My conclusion is exactly the opposite. We worry about the tail event. We have to worry about the possibility of a low probability but extreme outcome. That's the concern. And so we need to insure against that possibility. Now, if you talk about costs and benefits and ask yourself, gee, should I buy insurance? Should I insure my home? I hope you understand this, that the expected benefits from insuring your home are less than the cost. Why is that? Because otherwise there would be no market for insurance. Nobody would sell insurance if they expected to lose money. So when you buy insurance, you do so with hopefully an understanding that the insurance company is going to expect a profit, that your expected benefit is going to be less than the expected cost of the insurance. And that's the problem here. If you start looking at these expected costs and benefits, you're not going to get to the right answer, because what you're going to do is mix up an average with the possibility of an extreme outcome. Now, how likely is a catastrophic outcome in climate? We don't know. And how extreme would it be? We don't know. We can think about possible catastrophic outcomes. We can think about things that might happen. We could imagine that we could have an outcome that could lead to a drop in GDP 40, 50%. Maybe there's only a 10% probability of that. Suppose there are two possibilities. No climate change, no impact, zero, no problem, 90% likelihood. 10% likelihood of a catastrophic outcome that leads to a 50% drop in GDP, broadly measured to include health effects, morbidity, mortality, and so on. All right? The expected outcome, the average of all of that, is 0.9 times 0 plus 0.1 times 50. That's a 5% drop in GDP. And you might say, that's not such a big deal. That's just a bad recession. Not too bad. Therefore, let's not do much. But you see, the problem is that the 50% drop in GDP is much worse than 10 times worse a 5% drop. Because with a 50% drop, we have people starving, we have people dying. That's twice as bad as the Great Depression in the 1930s, where the GDP dropped by 25%, all right? So you have to look at that possibility of a tail outcome. And that's the reason that we have insurance. That's the reason that most of you, I expect, have health insurance. And if you own a home, homeowners insurance. Because you have to worry about that possibility of that extreme outcome. How much time do I have? 1 minute. So in the last minute, let me also emphasize that, we're talking about an absolute here, global net zero. If we went to an 80% decarbonization, we get most of the way there. It's that last 20% of decarbonization that's the most expensive. And that first 80% would give us a hell of a lot of insurance. So we don't have to make this a dichotomy of all or nothing. We could easily decide, yes, we're going to go to 80%, which is much more cost effective, easily done in terms of cost, than going to 100%. All right, let me stop here.
Thank you. We now have 2 minutes of cross-examination by the negative
Bob,
team.
let me assure you that I do carry health, home, and life insurance.
Oh, good.
Do you know what fraction of U.S. adults do not carry life insurance?
It's very high, I know
It's
that.
about half.
Yeah.
Okay? And you know why they don't carry life insurance?
Because they can't afford it.
They cannot afford it.
That's
right.
correct.
So there are countervailing considerations.
Yes.
They got to pay for the household and so on. So it's very important to include the cost of insurance against the outcome, if you like. All
I
right?
agree.
Now, if you were running China, I'll put you in charge, okay?
Good luck.
What would you do with respect to this issue?
With respect to life insurance or
No,
climate change?
no. Well, maybe life insurance is important for the Chinese leadership,
life insurance.
but no,
Look,
with
I think
respect to the need to ensure economic development and energy, and at the same time buy insurance.
Yes, and I think China is in fact going to be in the same situation where they're going to have to worry about extreme outcomes, the possibility of an extreme event. And that means they may go at it more slowly than we will. We are going to have an international agreement. Clearly, we're talking about global net zero. We're not talking about just the United States. China is a much bigger emitter of CO2 than the United States is. It accounts for much more. India is about 8% of global CO2 emissions, but it's rising very rapidly. We're going to have an international agreement, and my advice to the Chinese would be that, yeah, you're going to have to start moving to nuclear more rapidly. They are building nuclear plants more rapidly and decarbonize. Coal has been horrendous, had horrendous health impacts in China. So they are going to have to decarbonize, and they're going to have to do it maybe more slowly than we will, but they're going to have to do it.
Can we
Thank you.
request an extra minute?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting problem for China. It's a good example. They're building roughly a coal plant a week now and increasing their coal consumption rapidly. The solutions that we're offering in America, as I'm sure you know, is heavily weighted to photovoltaics. 90% of the world's photovoltaic cells are manufactured in China, 90% in China on coal-fired grids. China now burns 300 million tons of coal a year to produce the world's solar cells. And so what we're doing with our subsidies here is buying Chinese coal to install solar cells on roofs here, which is having no net effect on CO2 emissions, but it is transferring wealth to China and geopolitical power.
Thank you.
Seems like a bad trade.
Thank you. I'd like to give the negative team one last rebuttal, if you'd like.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, the affirmative team.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
well,
I'm not in favor of subsidizing China or taxing China or putting tariffs on China. So I don't believe in I don't think we should be subsidizing electric vehicles. I don't think that's the right way to do it. But that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
That's about how you get there. That's not about should you get there. Should you spend money to get there?
But it is about the cost of getting there,
Well, of course
which
it
is
is.
part of the resolution.
Of course it is. There are different ways to get there, and some ways are more costly than others.
Thank you.
And I would go for the less costly way.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to move on now. We're going to move on now to our fourth wave. Mark Mills has 8 minutes for the negative team.
Well, as we've seen, the goal to decarbonize global energy systems, as our noble opponents have pointed out, is that insurance policy. The cost of that insurance is self-evidently the key determinant of willingness to pay for insurance. And estimating those costs distills to a technology evaluation of the range of systems that are proposed that can be used and that can deliver energy at society scales. And it's in the cost of insurance, as the cost of the insurance rises to be as expensive or in the range of the cost of the consequences, we begin to have problems. There's a kind of a tendency these days to be captivated by aspirational technologies, unproven systems, often what could only be called, clickbait, with breathless headlines about, putative breakthroughs. The reality is that the industrial scale systems of any kind that can be built in the immediate future using technologies are those that we already know how to build and that were invented years ago and that are now mature and have viable supply chains, and relevantly, about which we know a lot. We have a lot of robust and reliable data, or to the point is, indeed, there's far more certainty about those costs than there are about the future costs, because it's about the future. We have some evidence that illuminates the real-world decarbonization costs, and over a similar time period that's contemplated by the decarbonists. The year 2000 is the same distance in our past as the target date of 2050 is in our future. And since the year 2000, the US and Europe have spent roughly $10 trillion to avoid, replace, or minimize use of hydrocarbons. And that did manage to lower the hydrocarbon share of global energy by about 2 percentage points, from 84% to 82%. But in absolute terms, the use of oil, gas, and coal have all increased, and collectively by an amount equal to, in oil equivalent terms, to adding 6 Saudi Arabia's worth of hydrocarbon production. Similarly, the decadal subsidies directed at electric vehicles, leading to some 40 million on the world's roads, out of 1.5 billion vehicles, has indeed displaced oil that would otherwise be used. But the absolute consumption of gasoline has risen and is now higher than any time in history. If $10 trillion didn't cause any net decarbonization, what would it take? Based on recent experience, and even assuming the favored technologies are overnight, say, 50% cheaper, which is not happening, to drive hydrocarbon's share of energy down to just half of all 2050 energy needs would take something like $100 trillion, over fivefold the increase in capital needed to be deployed in conventional markets over that same time period. And even then, the absolute quantity of hydrocarbons used in 2050 would still be about the same as today in order to supply a greater total world energy demand. And that assumes the central conceit that solar, wind, and battery costs will radically decline. And that claim is not supported by reality. The cost issue isn't from supply chain disruptions, from COVID lockdowns, but anchored in a core unavoidable fact. Far more metals and minerals are needed to build those machines than to build hydrocarbon machines. The IEA's analysis finds partial decarbonization would require fantastical increases in global mining, depending on the mineral from 4-fold to a 40-fold increase. Recent research at Yale found supplies would need to increase 60 to 300-fold depending on the minerals. And the point is that the core problem, as the IEA has pointed out, it takes 15 years on average to open a net new mine. The global mining industry is not now, nor planning to mine such quantities. Money and mandates can shorten it perhaps, but not by quantities at the speed that's relevant. The decarbonist response, of course, is that market forces will resolve this. And that's true, but not in the way they imagine. The effect of stunningly greater demand than supply will be staggering inflationary price escalation, something that will impact all markets because the same minerals are used everywhere. But for energy machines, the dispositive fact is that the material inputs constitute over 30% to 50% of the cost of solar cells and 50 to 70% of the cost of an EV battery. This disconnect is completely ignored in cost forecasts. The gap cannot be resolved by hand-waving about recycling, which can only slightly moderate the growth in net demand. Meanwhile, we have Germany as another source of macroeconomic evidence of real-world decarbonizing. Over the past 2 decades, the German government has roughly doubled the total capacity of its electric grid, primarily building solar and wind, but necessarily keeping about 80% of the original grid. But Germany's electric demand only increased by under 10%. The economic impact of that was to roughly triple Germany's electricity costs. This not only increased energy poverty in Germany, but makes it energy fragile, setting it up for disastrous consequences with the Ukraine war's loss of discounted Russian gas. If the solution to that problem were more wind and solar, Germany would have built that. Instead, they reversed course and built massive LNG import capacities. And the shift was too late, though, as data shows that Germany is catastrophically deindustrializing, largely because of high-cost energy. Meanwhile, here in the US, in the past half dozen years, we've seen a doubling in the wholesale prices for utility-scale solar and wind projects. At society scale, the experience has made a lie of claims that solar and wind, especially with battery storage, are inherently cheaper on a so-called life cycle cost basis. If that were true, the decarbonists at data center companies would be cutting the cord in building such solutions to meet the now obvious epic demands for electricity from the digital economy. And they're not. They're buying and refurbishing old nuclear plants, but that's a one-time limited deal. What they're doing is building gas-fired power plants. NVIDIA alone, for example, has shipped 5 million high-powered AI chips over the past several years, which will consume roughly as much electricity annually as 15 million electric cars. This says nothing about the inflationary impacts in the United States if the government does spend the money anticipated and subsidized by the Inflation Reduction Act, which is an undisguised energy spending program. The actual costs of the IRA are $2 to $3 trillion. For context, that rivals the $4 trillion in inflation-adjusted terms that the U.S. spent to prosecute World War II. And the IRA's inflationary spending doesn't include energy pursuits of similar spending in 2 dozen states, nor does it count the fact that if the EV-only mandates are enforced, utilities will be induced to spend an additional $3 trillion to expand grid delivery infrastructures. And this doesn't count the cost of building additional power plants. Taxpayers should be worried, not least because such spending is inflationary, but it creates epic opportunities for waste, fraud, and corruption. The scale of spending is perhaps better seen through the analysis done by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which dove into the IRA's interstices and found that the EV subsidies alone are $23,000 to $32,000 for each vehicle. This is truly China-level subsidization. The materials being bought are purchased from China, by the way. There's an inevitable future, of course, with lots more EVs, lots more solar and wind installations, but the imagined all-EV future, the all-wind and solar future, is economically and derivatively, politically impossible. If decarbonists were serious about cost effectiveness, they'd be far more focused on subsidies to induce purchases of, say, more efficient combustion engines. But the IEA's own estimate, for example, such a policy would reduce global oil use more than 7-fold greater than the number of EVs that are imagined for the year 2040.
We now have 2 minutes for response from the affirmative team.
Thank you, Mark. That was very interesting data. I certainly understand the situation in Germany is very bad. I want to ask you a hypothetical. Supposing the scientific community in the next few years managed to convince you that there was enough, let's say, existential risk in climate change that you'd want to do something about it. And supposing you were in a position to do something about it, I think you posed to us the idea of being a czar of China, but I'll say that just a plain czar. Yeah. Supposing you were persuaded that we had to do something, what would you recommend doing?
Well, the answer is in 2 buckets. One is patience, and the other is adaptation and resilience, for this very simple reason. The data that I study show that it isn't possible to, in fact, decarbonize society in the time frames imagined. A simplistic example would be not only to look at where carbon emissions are in fact going, even as we spend trillions of dollars. The electric cars are seen as zero-carbon vehicles, but building electric cars requires tons, gigatons of mining, unavoidably. These are with oil-burning machines. In fact, if the research is properly parsed, and it typically isn't, the actual emissions reductions from EVs is near zero, and in fact mean net increase emissions to the planetary atmosphere. This is because of the mining that's done elsewhere. So the answer is, if I'm czar, I say stop wasting money on yesterday's technologies, subsidizing those, which we're doing, and subsidize more basic research to find we'll call them miracles, the things that we can't imagine doing, which will take time, and then spend money on adaptation and resilience. I should note that that is exactly what Bill Gates said earlier this year at the end of the Davos conference, when he said, even if we succeeded in all of the net zero goals, the models will show that the temperature of the world in 2050 to 2070 will be largely the same, even if we achieve that. So he then said, we need to focus much more on adaptation and resilience and basic research to find the magic. Count me in that camp.
So your answer, just to clarify, to my hypothetical existential risk is we learn how to adapt to it.
Absolutely, because because the answer is, this is the same as saying, to use a ham-handed analogy, I'm going to have to jump off a cliff. The bridge isn't there, and I need to learn to fly, and so I'm going to jump and flap my arms harder. The gravity's going to win. I need to wait till I build a parachute before I jump off that cliff. The technologies that exist today do not permit society to function and decarbonize simultaneously, which is why it's not happening and won't happen. So it's not a moral question of saying we shouldn't do it. I am asserting that we can't do it.
Thank you. Let's just pause for a moment. We're hitting 8 o'clock. Maybe a deep breath, and I'll remind you of the Ruth Simmons line, quote, "We encourage ideas and opinions to collide in the service of learning," close quote. Some opinions and ideas are colliding. I just want to mention also that this is a debate, but the aim of this debate, this MIT debate series, is not to decide who wins the debate. Victory means something like deepening our understanding. So what we're doing now is trying to win in that sense of understanding better what different sides believe, why they believe what they believe, where you see strength, where you see weakness. How do you think of this question differently than you did when you walked in? We're going to continue that now by picking it back up. We're going to return now to our final round, which will be a 5-minute statement from each side. We're going to begin with the negative team. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, split it.
So the argument you just heard from the negative side.
I thought we would.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
You guys go first on the closing.
Yeah, sorry, I got that. Right.
I let you do it, so go ahead. Go ahead. Are you okay?
You want me?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I see that we do the affirmative first.
It's all right. You want to roll now? Roll it.
Yeah,
Go.
go ahead.
Okay,
Go
all
ahead.
right. Now, where was I?
Start again.
Wind the clock.
Well, I think you've heard that our distinguished opposition feels that in terms of mitigating climate change, it's not practical to do anything at all. I disagree with that. I'm not an economist, and I'm not an energy expert. But I have in front of me, as I said in my open statement, that 2 countries did at least decarbonize their electricity. And yes, I know that's not the whole game, right? And I agree with Bob that you can't do the 100%. Fine. But it's not that you can't do nothing. And we all agree, all of us agree, we have to absolutely continue to do research. And we have to learn some adaptation clearly. But I'm not ready to give up on mitigation because I've seen it done. You know, the cost of electricity from nuclear power in Korea is 4 cents per kilowatt hour, 1/4 of ours, right? They're exporting nuclear power plants, building them in Czechoslovakia, okay? It's becoming a lucrative export market. The idea that we could do something 50 years ago and we can't technologically do it today strikes me as a bit preposterous. So I again invite you guys to join me, and let's put a lot of effort into that because I think it's worth it.
Yeah, I'm just going to add that, again, we don't have to get to 100%. We're not talking about 2050 either. We're talking about the latter half of the century, sometime during the latter half, and it might be 2060 or 70. We don't have to get to 100% decarbonization. We could get to 80%, and that would bring us most of the way there. But, you know, to talk about the things we do now that are extremely inefficient, I agree, subsidizing electric vehicles is not an efficient way to go. We should do things efficiently, and, you know, I'm an economist, so I come to the carbon tax as the simplest way to do that. You look at what the social cost of carbon is, it's probably several $100s a metric ton, and you impose a tax roughly that size. And then you let the market work out how it's going to do it, whether it's going to be through wind or solar, or more likely it will be nuclear, because that's going to be the cost-effective way to do it, not through subsidizing individual things. So, you know, I'm all with you on there's a lot of waste. We're doing things that are that make no sense, that end up just shifting the pollution, but that doesn't mean we have to keep doing things that way. We could do things more efficiently.
We're going to move now to 5 minutes from the negative team. I want to remind the audience that we're going to move after this 5 minutes to questions from you. So if you have a question in your mind you want to ask, put into the air, maybe start formulating that now. We'll do 5 minutes now from the negative team.
We'll split it again. A dispassionate look at trends in demographics, development, and energy technology shows that global net zero by the end of the century would be an extraordinarily heavy lift, but also that the consequences of missing that goal will not be catastrophic, and that on balance, the disbenefits of decarbonization far outweigh the benefits on that timescale. That doesn't mean the world or we in the US shouldn't do anything. So here's what we should do. First, we have to sustain and improve climate science, for our knowledge is not at all what it should be. Second, we have to improve communications to the public. We need to cancel the climate crisis, even as we acknowledge human influences on the climate are growing, and we should be working to reduce them. Non-experts are savvy enough to dismiss unsupported scare stories, and credibility is eroding. Third, we have to acknowledge that energy reliability and affordability take precedence over reductions in emissions. A good start is the admission that oil and gas will be necessary in the US for the foreseeable future. Fourth, developed countries have to acknowledge the inevitability, if not the desirability, of meeting the developing world's energy needs. Most of the world today is energy starved, and fossil fuels are today the most convenient and reliable way of meeting that demand. Advocates of rapid global decarbonization never give a plausible path to meeting the developing world's energy needs. Fifth, there needs to be a greater focus on alternative strategies for dealing with the climate. Most important is adaptation. Bob, I know you're an advocate of adaptation. It's autonomous, it's what humans do, it's effective, it's proportional, and it's local, and hence politically achievable. Finally, governments have to embark on thoughtful, graceful decarbonization programs that incorporate technology, economics, regulation, behavior, and estimate cost, timescales, and actual impacts on the climate. An essential element is research, development, and demonstration of emissions-like technologies to reduce what Bill Gates calls the green premium. And as a nuclear physics PhD from MIT, I'm all with you both on nuclear physics. But programs that go beyond RD&D to meaningful deployment should not be scattershot mandates and incentives the way we're doing it now. Energy systems are recalcitrant for fundamental reasons, so they're best changed slowly, like orthodontia, not tooth extraction. And precipitous climate action is far more disruptive than any plausible climate change. It boggles the mind that the US is spending trillions on deploying unreliable energy technologies when we have so many more tangible and immediate needs like healthcare, infrastructure, education, etc. Mark.
So a key thing we need to acknowledge then is that virtually everything about this climate debate we're having is, insofar as putative solutions are concerned, we're really talking about energy technologies, not climate. And we need to acknowledge the stickiness of some fundamental, very long-run trends in energy domains, and trends that we're trying to bend effectively with money. The efficiency metric that we like to use, energy consumption per unit of economic output, always and has continually improved. The collateral long run and unchanged trend is that civilization increases its use of energy per capita in emerging markets and absolutely globally. This drive means that technology progress, which is underlying the efficiency trends, also underlies the trends to more energy demand. Another long-run trend with a nearly unwaveringly straight line tilting downwards is the continual decarbonization in civilization's overall primary energy supply. That trend left alone will continue, but sets natural long-run cadences at civilization levels have what can only be called high inertia. In general, there isn't enough money in society to bend such trends off their natural course. Society needs staggeringly abundant quantities of energy that have to be low cost. A carbon tax on hydrocarbons would provide not only 84% of all the world's energy, or 82%, they are involved in the production and all products and services, not some. The conviction, though, that many of us have that there must be something better that we can do to provide energy for humanity, it's well-founded. The issue is not if that's possible, but when and at what cost. We do know from history that foundational shifts in science and technology, and collaterally, revolutionary shifts in machines and tools, they do occur, but they have an inconvenient feature that Bill Gates framed as not having a, quote, predictor function. But for the next decade in our world, the world we live in the immediate future, the bottom line is that if we want revolutions and a stable society, we should stop squandering precious capital on yesterday's technology and, frankly, on the kleptocrats that collect it. The kinds of revolutions that we all want will require something, I'll say it again, that's in short supply. Patience. It's not that there aren't possibilities. There will be new physics. The promises of graphene, fusion one day, room temperature superconductors, who knows what dark energy is? Maybe it's useful. All these things are possible, but they take time and they're unpredictable. If we want more such magic, we'll have to refocus and reanimate on open-ended research, preserve capital for the growth of the world's economy. Thank you.
Yes.
I just want to make one very quick question to Steve. Steve, I thought you said, if I heard you right, that the probability of a catastrophic outcome is 0.
I didn't think I said that.
Yeah, you said that, but check your notes.
I'll check my notes.
While you check your notes, while he checks his notes, I wanted to now, we're going to move to the Q&A. Maybe just before we do that, though, I'll invite you just to join me in thanking our speakers for showing such humility and charity.
To read my notes exactly, the consequences of missing that goal will not be catastrophic.
Well, I thought you said the probability,
No,
the chance of a catastrophic
I don't think I said
outcome
that.
is 0.
No.
And it will not be catastrophic means for sure it won't be catastrophic.
Humans are remarkably adaptable.
So for sure it won't be catastrophic.
Well, it depends, catastrophic for whom. Certainly there will be parts of the
humans.
globe that are differentially impacted, but the annihilation of the human race, existential threat, I would assert, has 0 probability.
0, and that's a theorem, or you have evidence?
No, of course. We have
Well, we're talking about
gut
the future,
feelings.
so
All right.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move now to questions from the audience. Either raise your hand and we'll hand you a mic, or go to the microphone. I'll start at the microphone, please. And if you don't mind, please remember my virtues of charity and humility. I'll add a third virtue, brevity. So try to be brief as well.
I'm a little bit surprised that Richard Lindzen is not at one of those tables. It's shocking, quite frankly. My question is to the first speaker. You mentioned about a mother holding a child because 10% possibilities that they would get hit by a car. There is no cost in the mother holding the child. It's a couple seconds of time or maybe a little cry. Everything you presented here has an enormous cost to society, and I'm not sure if it's a cognitive dissonance or intellectual dishonesty, quite frankly.
And remember the virtue of intellectual charity. Would you like to reply?
Well, I would, in my little analogy with the child, I actually did mention that there would be a cost to the parent. Have to drive the child, might be late for work. It wasn't a large cost, but it wasn't 0. And on the other side, right, You mentioned, and I think I heard from our opposition that it would be catastrophically expensive to do this. But I also, in my opening remarks, cited two examples of large decarbonization, not 100%, by two countries where demonstrably it had no measurable effect on their GDP growth. And I'm an empiricist. I see that, right? I say it was done. The experiment was done.
Well,
and it worked. And why can't we do it today?
Mark, briefly.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that the France example is an excellent one for decarbonizing the electric system. But the French government ordered a study, it was published 4 years ago. They did not decarbonize their economy. Their net carbon emissions of the French citizens have risen over the last 25 to 30 years.
Yes.
What they did is they exported their carbon footprint largely to China and Asia, so the boundary conditions matter. We're talking about the planet.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to keep moving to the questions,
But
please.
everybody's
in the audience.
everybody's carbon footprint went up. Theirs
Yes.
didn't go up as fast.
I'm sure of more time. Kerry, I'm sorry, please, in the audience.
For sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Hanan. First of all, I want to thank both parties for coming. Love hearing both sides of the argument here. Also want to ask two questions for Mark based on just pure data points that you brought up. You stated the German government, when they were decarbonizing their grid and deploying more solar and more wind to be more renewable economy and trying to lean off of oil and gas. But when the Ukraine invasion happened, of course, that put them in a big mess. I feel like you'd also left out the decommissioning of nuclear plants in Germany, driven by social aspects and political aspects.
Right.
Yeah, that's one.
No, I didn't leave it out. I snuck it in a statistic. They kept the original grid at 80% of its pre-build-out size. The grid shrinkage was the shutting down primarily their nuclear plants, but they doubled their grid roughly, and they foolishly shut down their nukes. So it's really shocking. I mean, the Germans are supposed to be rational. And they built new coal plants, and they're burning North Carolina wood, coal-firing it with coal, and it gets legally called green energy, by the way. So the shell game is embarrassing. Did you have a second question?
Thank you. I'm actually going to have you hold your second question, and we can loop back around to it. I'm going to go back to the microphone, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm concerned that the benefits seem to be so vague and the costs seem to be relatively clear in this matter. For example, the MIT Integrated Global System Model published a peer-reviewed paper in Climate Change Economics that estimated a 10% of GDP penalty for stabilizing temperatures at 1.5 degrees C by 2075, which is about 0.2% cost per year to do that. So my question is to the affirmative team. If we assume that, lay aside the question of whether China or India will cooperate and so forth, if you were to describe the benefits of a $200 per year charge to the median American family having a $100,000 income, what would you, and you were trying to convince them that they're paying $200 a year for 50 years, offered them a reason that they should do it, what would your outline of the benefits to them be?
Thank you.
And also, when they say, I'm not interested in paying for insurance on somebody else's house or waterfront, what is your response to that comment?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, $200 that's a pretty low number. I don't know where that came from. I think that's kind of low. But if it's $200, the answer is, look, you're paying that to avoid future big problems. It's that simple. And, we're all going to pay it. So we're not asking you, how about you pay it, but you're worried that your neighbors are not going to pay it or the Chinese are not going to pay it. The deal here is that everybody pays it. Otherwise, this can't work. This has to be an international cooperative agreement. So we're all going to pay it. We're all going to pay it. We're all going to put in $200, which is a pretty small amount on a $100,000 total income. And the result is that we will have bought an incredibly important insurance policy.
Very briefly from the negative team.
Bob, I think that's a wonderful vision, but let me remind you that the world is full of competitive tensions for many different reasons. And getting all the nations together on this I think it's just politically unrealistic.
Thank you, thank you. That question about coordination we'll come back to, no doubt. I want to go to the audience, please.
Hi, thank you again for everyone for your time. I guess maybe to start this question with a comment, I guess as an engineer, I really think about the world as dynamical systems. And so when we think about the rise in temperature, I would say if I have a 2-degree fever, right, Celsius, then I would need chicken soup. But if I have 4-degree Celsius fever, I would die. Right? And so I want to sort of highlight the non-linearity, I think, of some of the assumptions that you guys are making, which I think is really important for this discussion because we're entering territory that we don't know about. If I want to sort of understand the negatives argument a little bit, right? The way that I understand the debate to be something similar to Pascal's wager, whereas Pascal's wager is a great way of sort of, it's an argument, it's a flawed argument, but it's an argument to sort of understand why someone would believe in God, right? It's maybe God exists, maybe God does exist, maybe God doesn't exist, and you believe in God and you don't believe in God. In a scenario where God exists, right, the rewards are infinite and the punishments are infinite and everything else is finite. Just for everyone's context, I'm not saying that you don't understand this, right? And the way I understand sort of the climate argument, if you would agree with me, right, is that on one axis, it's like, do we go, all out, however expensive it is or however feasible that you imagine, to really stop the climate issue, right, or not? And then the other side is, do we lose Florida? Do we have billions of people dying? And do we if that's a fair characterization, right? Is this how you would view the structure of the argument? And then the question then becomes, what is the probability that we will lose Florida and all that?
Thank you.
I think it really depends on who's doing the wagering. Maybe we have some people who are from sub-Saharan Africa or from the poorer parts of India or even just the poorer folks in the US. They would say, if I could draw my Brooklyn accent, get out of here with that stuff. I'm really worried about how I'm going to keep the lights on or how I can run a refrigerator. Right. And I can worry about all that other stuff later once I've achieved your standard of living. And in order to do that, I need that coal plant.
But it's a more fundamental, the response to counter, I would hear people say correctly, look, we'll pay for that. We'll pay for your solar panels in Africa. You can't afford, we'll spend the money. So it's just about the money in a sense. We'll give you, the poor nations, the technologies that we can afford and you can't. The problem I want to highlight again is that, and this is in the IEA's own research, they don't highlight it, but I commend you to read the entire documents they publish, all 300 pages, because the staff is very good there. The materials don't exist to build the machines that are contemplated for the next 30 to 40 years. We aren't mining enough copper, the most basic metal. It's the first metal ever mined by humanity before written history. We'll be short copper by a factor of 200% by the middle of the 2030s if we pursue these electrification plans. The lack of the capacity to mine the materials, and this is not easily solved by throwing money at it, it's a high inertia problem. That means that the solution is deprivation.
I did not cut your mic just now, if you thought I did. I was thinking about if I had that power, but I don't.
The Chinese produce a lot of copper, so maybe there's a hacking the mics here. The problem is the IEA acknowledges that it won't happen. The materials don't exist. So they posit, and the language is very explicit, behavioral changes. So to decarbonize, in addition to changing the energy systems, it is essential that we have less of everything. And in fact, they specifically say net zero plans require the number of homes in the world without a car needs to rise.
Thank you.
Mark,
Thank you.
Affirmative,
please, briefly. Please.
Yeah, I just want to take issue with what you've been saying about copper and other minerals. The elasticity of supply for copper is very high.
Yes.
And if you look at the behavior of copper prices and copper supply over the last 50 years, it's amazing how rapidly it responds to demand. Let me just finish. So it is extremely responsive.
Yes.
Mines are open.
Yes.
There are mines that have been shut down that are reopened.
Yes.
There's a lot of copper in the world. There's a lot of cadmium. There's a lot of cobalt.
Yes.
Now we're finding there's a great deal of lithium. And lithium mines are expanding, lithium production is expanding. Yeah. And the problem is the price of lithium actually is dropping rapidly because there's so much lithium. Right. So your concern is that there are no minerals, there's no copper.
No, you should look at that S&P Global study that came out about a year ago.
There are a lot of things I could look at, but I have studied minerals.
That's a factual current study, and it says we're going to be a factor or two short within the decade on carbon.
Thank you.
Okay, this
I'm
is
gonna-
exactly like the projections that we're not going to have
Thank-
oil, by the way. Do you
No,
remember
that-
the
Thank you.
stuff?
No, I'm sorry. I'm going to stop now. We have a long line of people waiting patiently. I'm enjoying this, but I think I will enjoy this more, I think. So please, to the standing
I
mic.
know, this can go on and on. This actually question comes from remotely from a team affirmative. And the question is, even if we are successful in getting to net zero by 2050, it means that the world will get hotter for 25 more years, together with all the adverse effects that accompany that such as fiercer hurricanes and more flooding. So unless we are willing to live with that, we need more immediate measures to cool the planet, even if they are just temporary. The only means of achieving this is the relatively near term, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, is global shading, which involves blocking a very small percentage of the sun's light before it reaches the earth. There are even ways to do this regionally if a global agreement cannot be reached. So why is this topic not front and center in any discussion on climate change?
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take that one, if that's all right. So it's absolutely true that if we could just magically shut off carbon some year, let's just say that as a thought experiment, the climate we have at that point in time would pretty much persist for 1,000 years. It's a very, very slow recovery. So there's only two ways to deal with that, if that's the concern. One is to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, which is technically possible, but at the moment much too expensive to do. And the other thing you mentioned that the people you were reading from mentioned was what we call solar geoengineering, which is very cheap, and we could do it, but there are downsides to doing that. So you bring the temperature back down to where you want it, the precipitation is a lot less, it's not a zero-sum game, and you're committed to doing it for thousands of years, again, unless you can pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that there are downsides to that, and there are a lot of discussions in the scientific community about this, but it is not now looked at, it's looked at as a very risky idea.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Middle of the audience, please. Please.
Hello, okay. So this is starting for the negative thing. You laid out at least two arguments. One argument was what crisis? The other argument was we can't get there. So if we ignore the we can't get there part for a moment, just hypothetically, since we're all talking here, do you both agree on what the risk is? So when as an engineer, when I say risk, there's an x-axis and there's a y-axis, which is the probability of that variable. And I have some expectation on this distribution. If I have a risk-neutral policy, it derives from the expectation. If I'm risk-averse, it derives from something else. So do you, first of all, agree on what the risk is? Because it's not obvious to me that this probability distribution is a given. That's what the uncertainty was all about. So A, do you agree on what the risk is, and do you agree on what the policy should be? Is it a risk-neutral policy? Is it a risk-averse policy? Because I'm hearing on one side that really it's not really where the risk is concentrated, but it's at this tails that can cause this catastrophic change. And on the other side, I'm hearing, well, look at the whole interval. What risk are you talking about? There's really nothing, especially when you look at the whole uncertainty. To me, the question then becomes, what is your level of aversion, A, and B, do we at least agree on the facts? Suppose, if we say evidence-based, do we agree on what the risk is?
Thank you. Let me encourage that let me just focus this question so we can focus on the question about risk assessment. I'm interested in each team to say what you perceive the other team's assessment of the risk being. Do they see it the same as you or differently than you? Do you want to try it that way?
I think our worthy opponents put a lot of faith in the fat tails, something very unlikely, but very impactful happening.
Does affirmative want
I wouldn't call
to
it
assess?
faith. I would say,
Right.
I would put a concern. So not only is, we don't really know the risk. We don't know what the probability distribution looks like. We don't know how fat the fat tails are, and we don't know how far out they are. So that's part of the problem here. We lack a lot of knowledge, a lot of uncertainty. There's uncertainty even over the uncertainty, over the extent of the tails.
So
So
maybe
I think we have to
Is the
worry
affirm-
about it.
Let me
Maybe
just-
I
let me
could
just interrupt for a
focus
second.
it a little bit.
Is the affirmative team agreed on that? Is Kerry, do you agree with that as well? About the thickness of the uncertainty?
Well, this is one place I don't quite agree with my teammate, is that we do know that there is a catastrophic tail, not from models, a little bit from physics, but also from geology. We know that in the recovery from the last ice age, there were very abrupt changes, which included abrupt changes in sea level, which if they occurred today, would be pretty catastrophic. You'd flood most of the major coastal cities of the world. We don't know enough to say that that probability is zero, because
Thank
it's
you.
happened before. So I agree that we don't know much, but we know something.
So even the maximum sea level rise during the recovery from the LGM
Yeah.
was about 4 times what it is currently, 12 millimeters
That's
a year.
right. It's
So
yeah.
12 millimeters a year is, let's see, about,
No, it's
4
more,
feet a century.
more sudden than that, Steve.
4
It's,
feet.
it's when land ice sheets
oh,
collapse.
the Damsgaard,
Yeah.
Osgard.
Well,
sort of
you know,
thing.
there's one philosophical problem where I have a divergence when we're doing costs. One thing we also don't know about the future, where there is tremendous uncertainty, but some directional knowledge, is what humanity, a century from now roughly, can do, our technology capacities. So we're making an estimate not just of consequence, but what are the capacities of our technologies 80 years from now. I would just offer as an obvious observation, if we went back 80 or 90 years and asked people to predict where our technologies would be today, I have a whole shelves full of books and literature on technology forecasting. None of us are particularly good at, but the trends we do know a lot about. The technology improves, gets better, not necessarily at an accelerating rate, but progressively. So humanity will be far better prepared in the future than the present. And one economist friend of mine at Oxford said to me that the challenge with spending money in the present to help people in the future is that absent global nuclear war, the one thing we know about people in the future is they're richer than the people in the present. So we're stealing from the poor, us in the present, to help the rich in the future. So as a sort of economic philosophy, it's not a great trade, and you're assuming they can't handle it. These are all guesses we're making. I'm assuming if the consequences are fatter, they'll be far more capable than we are.
Thank
We're
you.
far more capable than people
Thank
before.
you. Thank you. Do you want to very briefly reply? Because I want to go to the line. Are you okay?
Well, I would say by that philosophy, we should never give any money to our children. They're poorer than we are. They'll probably be richer than we are.
I'm giving you the last. I'm giving you the last word.
Well, that could
No,
be. They may see it that way. but,
I'm giving Kerry the last word. Let's go to the line now, please. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much. Professor Emanuel, I've been impressed by your support for nuclear power. So what we've seen in Germany is that the same Green Party that has been a big proponent of wind and renewables has also been advanced shutting down nuclear power plants. In my view, my perspective in the US, it's very similar, that the organizations, the NGOs, the governments, and other that are most supportive of renewables, specifically PV and wind, are also the most strongly opposed to nuclear power in the US, which to my mind doesn't make sense if the goal is carbon reduction. How do you explain the disconnect, please?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So very briefly, I think what you've described is accurate, but I'd like to give you a little cause for optimism. In the last 4 years, there's been an amazing amount of legislation passed in the Congress with amazingly bipartisan support. That would start taking some of the artificial brakes off of nuclear power in the United States. Because the main problem, the reasons it's so expensive, is it's been very unwisely and poorly regulated. And there's a long story behind that. So I see some cause for optimism, and even some environmental groups are beginning to drop their opposition. So yeah, the ship is slowly turning.
Thank you. I want to go directly to the next question
Can I just
because of
quickly
time.
say,
Very briefly.
100% on the same page on that. I spent the week of the accident at 3 Mile Island, the next decade of my life, defending the virtues of nuclear energy. And I failed because we abandoned our nuclear industry. There is bipartisan movement. I think the environmental movements who are against it are on the wrong side of history, and I think they will lose this time. They won last time.
Thank you. Thank you. Back to the queue, please. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have a question for Bob. You started to talk a bit about the discount rates and said that they, well, don't matter so much maybe, and the whole debate wasn't so much about discount rates until the last thing you said. But I think with the Stern report and the Nordhaus report and all these integrated assessment models, usually it's always about, okay, how much do we pay now to invest in the infrastructure that we need, and then we need to weigh the costs that we have today against the benefits that we have in the future. So I'm wondering why this didn't play a bigger role in the debate we have had today.
Thank you.
I'm a little confused. You're asking why we didn't talk more about the discounting of the future, or the
yes,
because
like,
people get confused by it, and because not everybody agrees on how we should discount.
Yeah, exactly.
But I will say one thing related to this. We've kind of made this oversimplified. We've said, look, we're going to spend a lot of money today, this year, in order to help people 50 years from now. They'll get the benefits in 50 years, but we're going to pay a lot of money today. It's not quite like that. We're going to begin today, and we're gradually going to spend money, and people will benefit gradually more in the future than today, but it's all going to be gradual. So it isn't like now versus 50 years from now. It's a gradual change.
I'm going to go right to the next. Thank you. Next question, please, from the queue.
It's going to get more easier.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. So the affirmative team, we're going to make you kings for a day. We're going to collect money from every citizen on the planet, as you've suggested, but now you get to allocate that money, and how are you going to do it? Are you going to spend it on wind, solar, nuclear, resilience, research? I'd like to know how you want to allocate the money that you're going to collect.
Thank you. You get to be czar again.
Well, I might even go to Mark for advice on this particular kind of breakdown. But seriously, I mean, the thing is that markets do a pretty good job with energy if they're allowed to. There's big market distortions going on in the U.S. and the world. We talked a lot about Germany, which is really bad.
Yeah.
But it's happening here, and we just talked about that it's beginning to change. And so I would try through policy to accelerate that change. And I actually believe we can do it at not that much cost. At least we can start to do that, simply because we have all these examples I keep coming back to in front of us where it was done. And we have the example today of South Korea as very, very reasonably inexpensive, not just for the cost of electricity, but the capital costs of building plants aren't nearly as large as they are
It's important to understand the magnitude of money we're talking about.
Yes.
There are estimates to decarbonize the U.S. There's a range of costs, but average about 5% of GDP per year, which is just about as much as we outlay for Social Security every year.
Well, very quickly, I priced out the cost of building a nuclear power plant in South Korea. If we take the projections of energy use in 2050, we could build power plants. It's not all the other costs. It's about $500 billion. $500 billion a year.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. So for those in the audience, the queue is now closed. If you're not standing behind a microphone, stay in your seat if you don't mind. At least don't go back into that. Don't join the line. Please.
So my question was for the gentleman on my extreme right. You made a lot of interesting points about the costs of the energy transition, and I was just curious whether, I might be asking you to repeat yourself, but just why you think it's too expensive beyond the supply chain constraints you were mentioning about metals, and particularly why those outweigh the immediate economic benefits of these low carbon technologies, namely the fact that they have low to zero marginal cost, they reduce local pollutants, which are quite deadly, literally. And we haven't really mentioned this, but energy efficiency measures, which don't deal with electricity per se, but do save on energy costs. So whether there's other reasons beyond supply chains that outweigh the factors.
So let me just say about efficiency, and then Mark will deal the other. There's this thing called Jevons paradox, which says the more efficient you make something, you don't get all the benefit because people use more of it. And just think about GPUs as a wonderful example. If NVIDIA were able to make GPUs twice as efficient, you'd sell twice as many GPUs, if not more. So efficiency is not the panacea most people think it is.
The problem with the solar and wind low marginal cost is very true. Nuclear power plants have very low marginal costs. Hydro dams have very low marginal costs. So the two things are important. First, capital matters. Cost of money, and I'm pretending to be an economist here briefly. I don't want to tread on economics turf, but capital in the present has extraordinarily high costs, social costs and external costs when you deploy it and you don't do other things. So when you look at energy systems, the practical reality is you increase the share of a grid that's using episodic power. You have to do one of two things, and both are typically done. You have to build excess capacity, because obviously it's not just a diurnal effect. It's not day-night. It's a seasonal effect. The wind is seasonally twice the intensity, off-season and on-season. Sun in California, you have twice the amount of sunlight on-season versus off-season. So that doubles. So even if the capital cost is exactly the same as, say, a gas turbine, you need more than twice as many of the episodic power plants. Then you have to either have the other power plants on standby and available, underutilized, which increases their real costs.
Thank you.
Which is what happened in Germany. Or you need storage, which costs a lot of money.
Thank you. And I told this panelist quietly before the event that when I said thank you, that means...
Stop.
Yeah, stop, we'll say. That's not what I said to you, as you remember, but thank you. We have 3 more people in the queue, including Mr. Pascal at the very end, which I'm so happy about. So 3, 2, 1, 3, please.
I have a question for the negative team. This is maybe an unsubstantiated hypothetical, but give me some intellectual charity here. Suppose the calamity happens in like 10 years or tomorrow. Would you still argue that even then we'd be more equipped in 10 years or tomorrow to deal with it? And I guess what I'm asking is, can the calamity ever reach such a severity, happen so soon, with such a certainty, that it ever makes decarbonization today worth it?
Yeah, so what kind of calamity are you thinking about?
The most severe that people project. It's hypothetical. Florida goes under, the world's on fire every day.
Collapse of an ice sheet, maybe.
Sorry?
Collapse of an ice sheet.
Yeah, okay, even that will take a while to raise sea level.
But he's asking the question about limits.
No,
do you see a limit?
Sorry?
The point is, in the extremist limit, is decarbonization worth starting today?
Well, if you started today, you're not going to make much effect for over the 10-year period. Okay? So you go to war with what you got.
Well, the other problem is that, this is to answer your question, relates to my esteemed economist's observation about how markets respond to copper. They have. Metal markets are really well studied, and they're very responsive to price. What the economists and the mining industry is looking at is the current capacity of all the mines and the planned expansion of the mines and the amount of money it takes to expand the mine and how long it takes. And if we were to start tomorrow to build at the scale imagined, it would require lots of copper. In the world, it doesn't matter how much money we throw at the miners, it still takes them 10 or 15 years to actually open the mine.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to invite the affirmative team to speak if you'd like. Does the affirmative team want to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
It doesn't take 15 years to open a copper mine. Copper mines are opened much faster, and there's a lot of copper. We're not looking at proved reserves. We're looking at potential resources.
We agree that the supply in the crust, in my opinion, I'm non-Malthusian. I think it is infinite.
Yeah.
But you'll have to argue with the IEA survey of the global mining industry, and you'll have to argue with Rio Tinto and a net new mine is 15 years. Expanding existing mines.
They should hire you.
Thank you. I'm moving back.
Couldn't do it?
I'm moving back to the queue now. So
we disagree on that.
That was 3. This now is 2.
Sorry. Hi, I like specifics, so this is a question from Mark. What are your metrics for whether a technology is ready to deploy, considering that tech often needs iterations to become efficient? And also, are there any that you think are particularly promising right now?
Sorry, what was the last part?
Any technologies that you think are particularly promising right now that you're excited about?
So the metric for viability is a scaling metric, and it varies from technology to technology and application to application. But when I did a lot of venture work, that was the question we always asked when we went to visit a company that had invented something and had something in a lab or a pilot, is when is it really ready to be commercially viable? We know the answer to the question for electric vehicles. It was roughly 2012, Tesla S released, and And people had tried to make EVs for the last centuries. Studebaker shut down in 1912. So it's scaling. So consequence, and the issues we're talking about, is when you have the supply chain in place to scale at a price markets will pay. And that we have, solar is there now, it's scaled. Wind is there now, it's scaled. You know, so we know a lot about it. What's the most promising thing? Well, two things on the supply and demand side. The smaller modular reactors, it's a silly word, they're not modular. But the smaller reactor designs, and some of them come out of MIT, there are about 80 of them in the world. I think all of them will work when they're built. I think probably 20 or 30 of them will be economically viable. But as all engineers know, I was trained as a physicist, not as an engineer, but I worked as an engineer.
Thank you. You wanted to say the second one?
It takes a decade to scale a machine, to design a machine that you can scale.
Mark, do you want to mention the second one as well, briefly?
Sorry?
Do you want to mention the second as well, briefly?
You know, the graphene is a stunning material. And the magic angle is really magical. It enables superconductivity, possibly at extremely high temperatures.
Thank you.
Tantalizing.
Your teammate wants to say something very briefly.
So one perhaps surprising one I think is particularly promising is deep underground coal gasification with sequestration. And I'll just leave it at that. People can talk to me later if they
Thank you.
want.
Thank you. Does Affirmative want to get involved in this about what you see as most promising? You didn't.
Nukes again.
Nukes again?
You and I are nukes.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move now to our Pascalian, Wagerian last question.
Thank you for letting me ask 2 questions.
I never allow anyone to ask a second question, but your first one was so wonderful that I can't stop you, so please.
Hopefully the second one is as good. I totally agree with the assessment that part of the debate comes down to what technologies. I totally agree that like the assessment on this question really depends on the availability of technology in the future, which is hard to foretell, right? We might have fusion, it might solve the problem, and we have wonderful new materials, which is what I work on, and that might solve the problem. But on the other end, right, if it doesn't solve this problem, we know that this is a public good or free rider problem, right? And we have this situation where we have countries that say, well, you know, when's my turn to pollute? So we actually find the fact that it's extremely catastrophic. On both sides, would you agree that we would then need to go to war in order for this to be affirmative? Do we need to go to India and say, like, blow up their coal plants and maybe we'll airlift some nuclear plants over and so on?
So I hope we don't go to war over this or anything else. And I got to say, look, this debate is about whether the costs exceed the benefits, okay? And it's not about what do we think will happen. I'm actually quite pessimistic about what I think will happen. I don't think great things will happen. I think it will be very difficult to get an international agreement, which is what we need, because otherwise you do have a free rider problem. I think it's going to be very hard. I'm not optimistic at all. I think it's quite likely that we'll hit 3 degrees. I don't know what will happen when we hit 3 degrees. There's a great deal of uncertainty. But unfortunately, I think it's going to be tough. But again, that's not the proposition we've been debating here.
Thank you. Any last comments on that question?
If,
Mark, briefly.
If you weight the probability of something happening with the impact, climate change is probably pretty far down the list. I'd look, as we were talking last night, nuclear conflict, pandemics, coronal mass ejection. These are all things that have happened before and have catastrophic consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of bad things can happen.
Well, I'll say that I don't disagree that there's a possibility of the scenarios that you're laying out. But however, I'm extremely optimistic that we'll be able to handle consequences. Nature's been trying to kill humans for all of history. Humans, are, whether they're bugs or earthquakes, this is just what nature does to us. We are Homo faber, we're tool builders. And the reason I wrote my book, and I'm not just pitching my book, we should read them as counterpoints, is that I'm extraordinarily optimistic that we're at a pivot point comparable to a century ago on our capacities to build new classes of technologies. And it's not technologies just to make energy, but all of the technologies that are relevant to giving us resilience against the predations of nature.
Thank you.
And one of them is, of course, that climate will change. It's always doing that.
Thank you, Kerry.
So we
would you
have
like
one optimist and 3 pessimists, and we'll hand out antidepressants when you leave.
Kerry, would you like the last comment?
Well, Well, I'd just like to give my own point of view, which is different from Steve's. I think this is pretty far up the list of things that I worry about, probably because I study it. I study the geological record. I know what's happened. I'm not in favor of waiting because I think we actually have the technology. And again, I'm coming back to nuclear. Fantastic if we can bring new nuclear power. I'm all for it, but I wouldn't hang around and wait for that. I mean, I'd start building it now, but I'd really start clearing the way for markets to do what they're supposed to do, and which I think nuclear would come out very well. And let me just end by saying that the huge growth of projected energy is, a lot of it comes from trying to alleviate poverty that Steve alluded to in developing countries. There's 800 million people with zero access to electricity. That's terrible. And the fact is, when they're that poor, they have lots of kids, and population growth is a driver of climate change. So to get on top of that curve, you need to burn a lot of energy. We have the technology, but we aren't letting it happen. And it's not even a question of making it. It's a question more of getting out of the way. We can do this. We can reduce the risk, not to zero. We can do it. Let's do it.
Thanks so much. So we're at the end now of the MIT Great Climate Policy debate. I just wanted to say again that our criteria for success in this debate is deepening our understanding, and I think we've done a good job with that. I want to just say something and observe something, if I may, as an outsider coming to this community. There's something kind of remarkable happening at MIT that I think is happening at some other colleges and universities in the country, but at MIT it seems to be happening in an intensified way and also a particularly productive way. What I see happening at MIT is that there's this very interesting thing of alums who are seriously concerned about some things that have happened at MIT they were not very pleased about in recent years, who are responding in a very positive ways of coming back, giving their time, giving their attention, giving their hearts to making MIT the kind of place they always wanted it to be. And the fact that MIT alums, some of you wearing the red blazers in the audience, some of you who are the organizers of this event, have cared enough about this place to make this kind of events happen. And the fact that you're drawing students, graduate students, undergraduates, faculty, and members of the community is a really remarkable thing. I think the MIT community should be aware of how special that is that this is happening at this university. So I want to just end by thanking you all for coming, and please join me in giving a round of applause to our virtuous panelists.